So what is it they say you've got like 5 seconds to grab someone's attention? Well, Locus Battle Command is free. You download it, no cost to your wallet, links in the description. So it's been just over, at least the time of recording, it's been just over 2 months of me having released Locus Fleet Commander. And then I went dead for a bit, and now I'm back, and you may notice I do this quite often, where I for a couple months go quiet and then we'll come back with something. That's just me, that's how I work, that's my nature, it's how I operate. And now I've returned to you with a spin-off game for Fleet Commander, and that's Battle Command. Remember that, it's Fleet Commander, but it's just Battle Command. I have a feeling some people are going to get Mandela affected by that and get mixed up with which one is the commander and which one isn't. But Locus Battle Command is focusing on the ground forces rather than the navy. It's a 10mm game, and so most of the units are about a 1 to 200 scale. And while Fleet Commander focuses on battles that may be made up of more of like 7 to 8 ships, Battle Command lends itself a lot more into much larger scale battles with lots and lots of units. But they are still very similar games. It is designed so that you can very easily hop between one to another. Now naturally there are lots of different rules, and I'll go over the rules for Battle Command in this video. But it is intentionally designed so that if you know how to play one, you'll have a very good grasp of playing the other. For this video, I believe it would be wise to start off with the actual rules, then discuss the factions, and then go over the story, and then my future plans for the game. And we'll brief over the rules in the same order as which the rules book does. So the first thing to go over is what you're actually going to need and how to play it. Well, the first thing's obvious, is you just need to download all the model files. You can find them on Cults 3D, Thingiverse, or on my Discord server. I will also say that I am very open to talking to people. The Discord server is a great place to go if you want to actually talk to me or ask me any questions. But that aside, once you've downloaded all of the files that you'll need, and they all come together in this, it's just as one bundle, then what you need is a 3D printer. I guess you don't necessarily need it. If you know someone with a 3D printer, they can print it off for you. But it is designed to be, as the title suggests, a 3D printable tabletop game. If you have all the models, then you need a measuring tape with metric on it, a D6, which is just a 6-sided dice, this game only uses D6s, and a scatter die, and possibly notepad and pencil if you want to write down any statistics or unit data that you want to keep at hand. And that's about that for what you're going to need. Now in terms of the turning sequence, it's the exact same as Locus Fleet Commander, where one player goes and then the other, and each one has a movement phase, a combat phase, and then an auxiliary phase. So starting off with the movement phase, this is a little bit more complicated than in Locus Fleet Command, and the reason for that is rather than everything moving in the same way, all the different vehicles will have different movement types. So the standard movement type for an infantry squad is it can just go anywhere within the range of its movement. It's probably the simplest. As long as its path isn't being blocked and it has a clear route to get somewhere, it can just move anywhere within that particular radius, be it 8 centimeters or 10 centimeters or 15. Tracked vehicles, which are the most common kinds of vehicles you'll get, they have to move straight forward sort of thing. So they can turn at the start of their movement sequence, they have to turn and then move forwards, and they can move up to whatever their movement distance is. If it's a wheeled vehicle, it can't turn on the spot and it has to move, turn and then move again. Effectively, if you want to, let's say you want to move at 8 centimeters but you also want to turn, you have to move at 4 centimeters, then turn and then move another 4 centimeters. Wheeled vehicles also can't move over rough terrain. Now the next is walkers. They're effectively the same as infantry, except they can't move through rough terrain that's larger than their base. And I'll discuss what constitutes as rough terrain later. Aerial vehicles can just go wherever they want. They can just move wherever they want within their radius, within their distance. Since they're zipping around in the sky, they're just not affected by terrain at all. Field guns are the last movement type, and they can't move at all unless they're being transported. Something just needs to pick them up and take them somewhere. All of your units will have a movement distance for the maximum distance they are actually able to move, which is simple enough, that's on their stat sheet. After that, we now get into combat. So the first thing to go over is ranges. Unlike Fleet Commander, there are no range modifiers. Things just have a base range that they can fire at. It'll be 20 centimeters or 60 centimeters, whatever the weapon can fire. However, you do sometimes have a minimum range, and this is common on artillery pieces, where if a unit is within 10 centimeters, then they can't shoot at them. Of course, the minimum range will be in brackets after the actual range, and this will change from vehicle to vehicle. Each vehicle in the game can only pick one target per turn. Now this can depend. Certain weapon types such as area of effect or spread weapons, you don't really have to pick a target, you just have to fire it in a direction. But most weapons, which will often be armor piercing, do require you to pick a specific target. Which actually neatly brings me on into weapon types. Now there are only 4 weapon types. There's armor piercing, which is just your standard weapon, you just point it at a target and shoot. There's area of effect, which is common on artillery, where let's say you launch a shell and you use a d6 and a scatter die to see where it lands. The accuracy for a sort of area of effect weapon will usually be something like 2d6 for example, and this is actually just how many d6s you have to roll with the scatter die in order to see where the shot lands. Much like in Fleet Commander, after it says area of effect or AOE, the number in the brackets is just the radius. Anything within that certain distance to the hit marker will take damage. Then there are spread weapons. This is common with, let's say, flamethrowers or sonic weaponry. This is effectively just pick a firing arc and fire from it, because vehicles will have firing arcs. You just have forward, back and the sides. Some weapons can only fire forwards, some weapons can only, well, I say all weapons can fire forwards. It would be pretty silly to mount a weapon on a vehicle that doesn't fire forwards. I say some weapons can fire like only forwards, some will only fire front, sides, rear, some will only fire the front and the sides. It does depend, but for spread weaponry you effectively just pick a firing arc and just anything within that firing arc is just destroyed, and obviously the distance of the arc, it will tell you what that is on the weapon's range. And then the last one is melee. Now when you roll melee will actually change how the weapon power based on how well you roll to hit. If let's say you need a 4 to hit but you rolled a 5, then the weapon power will go up by 1. So if the weapon power is base 4, then rolling a 5 means the weapon power now goes to base 5. Or if the weapon power is only 2 and you rolled a 5 and you needed to roll a 4, then the weapon power will go up to 3. You of course just got to bonk stuff hard enough. But now we'll go over the damage tables. So the first table is just to hit. All you do is you put your weapon accuracy up against the enemy size rating and just see what you need to roll in order to hit. And when it comes to the damage table, this is where things start taking much more drastic turns from Fleet Commander. So in Fleet Commander most weapons just did a base 1 damage, and if you hit you'd need to roll again to see how well you hit. But because Locus Battle Command is designed for much bigger armies with many more units, and also many vehicles are about the size of the guns of some other vehicles, it doesn't exactly make sense to have everything do a base 1 HP damage. And so if you hit something in Battle Command, you will automatically do damage. All the table actually shows you is just how much damage the weapon does. So if your weapon has a power of 6 and the enemy has an armor rating of 5, then you'll do only 3 points of damage. However, this is where things get a bit more interesting, is that weapons have an AP, or armor piercing. This is actually how well a weapon can penetrate armor, and if it has a higher rating or lower rating than the enemy armor, then it can actually change how much damage it does. If the armor rating and the weapon armor piercing are the same, are they equalized, then it doesn't change, your weapon power just stays the same. But if your armor piercing is above the armor rating of the vehicle you're attacking, then your weapon power goes up by 1. However, if it's double or more than the vehicle you're attacking, then it goes up by 2. If it's lower, then of course it's decreased by 1. If it's less than half of your enemy's armor rating, then your weapon power is decreased by 2. I could not tell you why, but throughout explaining that I was doing hand gestures. I don't know who I was doing that to because you can't see it, so I guess I was just putting on a show for the little demons in the corners of my bedroom. Anyway, there is like a bunch of other stuff such as like shots for combat and all that, but those are pretty basic and you can just read up on them in the rules. We will move on to our last phase, the auxiliary phase, and this is where you just do any other bits that you might need to do that don't fit into the other 2 phases. This is the phase where you can embark or disembark soldiers from vehicles. Let's say if you've got infantry squads in a transport or you have a field gun hooked up to a transport, then this is where it'll get detached or embarked. Vehicles can also repair if they don't move or shoot that entire turn. Then in the auxiliary phase they can repair where they roll a D3. And I know I said this game only uses D6s, but a D3 is just going to be half of whatever you've rolled on a D6. Anyway, that aside, the next thing is in Battle Command you have battle orders. Battle orders do rely on your platoons, and I will get into that in a moment, but effectively you have command units on the board. You'll have lieutenants, captains and generals. I do plan on adding more battle orders, but there's only really 3. It's either give yourself an extra firing turn, an extra movement turn, or give yourself like the initiative to gain extra victory points. During the auxiliary phase, the way you initiate a battle order is just by rolling the dice, and that tells you what command unit's able to do it. If you roll a 1, then well, you fail the roll and you can't use a battle order. If you roll a 2, then the order can be issued by a lieutenant. And because lieutenants are in charge of a platoon, it means that only 1 platoon in your army gets access to the battle orders. Now, if it's a captain, captains will usually have command over about 3 platoons. And so if you roll a 5 up, then 3 platoons in your army get access to the battle order. And if you roll a 6, that means your general issues the battle order, which means your whole army gets access to it. However, battle orders rely a lot on your army makeup and how they're built, and we'll discuss that soon. Because before then, we need to go over the advanced rules. So the first is infantry. Now infantry operates very similar to how fighters operated in Locus Battle Command. You will have a certain amount of infantry units per base. Usually it'll be 6 for a standard squad, but you could have either 3 or 4 depending on the type of infantry. And the way an infantry squad works is different for a regular vehicle because it's technically multiple units. So if an infantry squad gets hit by a weapon, of course the damage is distributed throughout the squad. But most of the time infantry will tend to only have 1 HP. But on the stat sheet it will say 6, well that's because there's 6 squad members. On certain heavier infantry they may have 2 HP, and so that's a bit different, but with the standard infantry squad they often have 1 HP. And it operates the same way it does in Locus Fleet Commander for fighters, where the more, the lower the health of the squad goes, the less shots it gets. So for the standard rifles, that it says 6 shots because there's 6 guys with the rifle. And so if an infantry squad is reduced to 5 HP, then well it's only going to get 5 shots. Of course this will change for something like, let's say, a destroyer squadron, which only has 3 members, and so that means each member actually has 2 HP. So for every 2 HP it loses, it'll lose a shot from its weapons. It'll say next to where unit type, how many squad members that there are. This is actually the same for special weapons teams. Since these guys are also types of infantry, they get a little number for how many is in their squad. After that we then have aerial transport. So you can get aerial transports, and every faction uses the same aerial transport right now, the S-47, made by our boys in the Salsar Shipping Company. So aerial transports is effectively how you move units in and out of reserves. Now there isn't all that much you can do in reserves. Reserves will just say that you effectively can repair them, but you can do that on the battlefield anyway. I think the best thing is that you can effectively just repair them without the worry of the fact they're still on the battlefield, and so I suppose it's a safer way to get them repaired. I think a better idea for use for vehicles in reserves, and any platoons that you want can just go into reserves, but I think the better idea is to bring them onto the table later, like keep them in reserves at the start of the game and then bring them on later, because aerial transports can fly over most obstacles, and so it'll be an easy way to transport platoons to anywhere you need them on the battlefield. Of course, just watch out for enemy anti-air fire, though that may only really work on much larger scale maps. But there's nothing stopping you from making an absolutely ginormous map if you really want to. However, to leave and enter the map, your vehicles have to return to your starting position. Your player starting positions are the only way to get vehicles on and off the board. Aerial vehicles have to go through there to put things in and out of reserve. And aerial vehicles themselves that are damaged have to go in reserve in order to repair. They can't do it on the battlefield. There are some unique aerial vehicle rules, but we're going to skimp over them because they're not a big part of the game. If you want to look up them, the rules book is free to download. I will also be skipping over the battlefield and terrain types, as this is another thing that is easy to just read up on, because this now is where we get onto army building. How do you actually build armies? Well, armies in Locus Battle Command are made up of platoons, and you have a variety of different types of platoons listed. To form a platoon, you must first have your command vehicle as your centerpiece, and then go down one of the branches in order to see what vehicles to take, or various units. If you want, let's say, an armor platoon, then you can select 3 armor units. But let's say if you want an infantry platoon, the way it's laid out is that you have to take one before the other. So if you want a special weapons team, you're going to have to take an infantry squad first. It isn't required that you fill a platoon completely. You can, if you really want to, for an infantry platoon, just take a command squad and 2 infantry squadrons. Of course, the way battle orders work means it lends itself better into taking larger platoons, but that said, that's just some tactics, I guess. But while you don't have to fill up everything, if you want access to auxiliary units that the platoon gets, you are required to take the full main branch. So if you're taking an armoured platoon and you want armoured support vehicles, then you have to take 3 armoured units with it in order to be able to take any of the armoured support. And of course, platoons are made up of specific unit types, and in a vehicle's datasheet it will say what unit type it is. Some weapon options may change the unit type, though it will be listed underneath that weapon whether it does or doesn't. Currently there are only 6 platoon types, and in future expansions I may add more, but 2 of those are command platoons, and those are for the army building. Now, I mentioned before that a lieutenant would be in command of a regular platoon, but a captain is in command of a command platoon. In order to form a proper army, depending on the points cost, you have to put 3 platoons under a command platoon, and there has to be at least 2 command platoons for a general. Now, this is done more bottom up rather than top down, and so you don't need a general on the map. And in fact, you don't need a command platoon either. You can just play a game with just 3 regular platoons if you'd rather. However, in order to have a command platoon, you need at least 3 regular platoons, and in order to have a general, you need at least 2 command platoons. And while it is not necessary to completely fill a regular platoon, command platoons do need to be completely filled. Locus Battle Command does certainly have a big focus on actual army structure, though even then it's still decently flexible. And the army building is a pretty large aspect of this game. That is basically just the generally what you need to know to play the game. There are other bits here or there, and I would advise you to give the rules book a good skim over. After that, it's just the story. So the story picks up shortly after where Locus Fleet Commander left off. If you're unaware of the Locus story up until now, let me give you a good rundown. Effectively, a gigantic empire called the Great Realm is conquesting the stars, retaking a lot of old lost territory under the command of its dictator, Emperor Costanza. Costanza is going on a massive crusade across the stars to destroy all of humanity's enemies and effectively unite it under one regime. He rules for about a century, but dies before his plans can fully be realised. And so, in the midst of fighting fighting all the horrible little aliens from outer space, the aristocrats and apparatchiks of the Great Realm have a bit of a falling out. A man called Leoyenith Amisara takes control of the Principality of Carapath, and several decades later, and approximately 1 decade after Constanza's death, leads it in rebellion against the Great Realm's regime. Locus Fleet Commander details the beginnings of Leoyenith's war, and how the Great Realm's forces in the outer regions were crushed and scattered. Locus Battle Command continues the narrative of the early days of Leoyenith's conflict. The two main sides in it are the Solar Tempest, which is the main assault force of the Great Realm. It's a specific Solar Tempest legion called the Phantom Blades, who have for the past few decades been trapped in the outer regions of the galaxy fighting various horrific monsters, primarily the Zenthar. The Phantom Blades are effectively left unaware of the predicament and the unfurling situation in the rest of the galaxy, and so as they return, they are met with Carapathian forces and get into a conflict with them. After a meeting with Admiral Keen, who is briefly mentioned in the Locus Fleet Commander Rules book, they begin devising a plan of action, and so much of the story details the Solar Tempest's military campaign in attempting to destroy the world of Castil. Castil is a manufacturing planet, most of its population living very miserable lives deep within the bowels of these factories, producing war machines for the endless conflicts that the Great Realm was already in. But of course, Castil is within Colgaran territory. Colgara was a dominion of the Great Realm, much like Carapath, but since Leoyenith's rebellion, they've effectively broken away with Carapath. And so now Castil is supplying the Carapathian war machine. As a result, the Phantom Blades and the Imperial Navy decide that it's a very good idea to destroy the planet, or at least the factories on the planet, in order to deal a heavy blow to the Carapathian manufacturing. Now what I've done here is, in Fleet Commander where the story just details it out like a history book, here I've actually attached a campaign to the story that you can play. Now of course you can design your own campaigns, feel free to do so, but here I do have an official campaign with each chapter of the story. There is a battle scenario to go with it. I'm not sure how much I'll be doing this with future projects, but if this sort of thing works, then I will likely do it with all projects where I give them a unique campaign. But most of the conflict in the story is between the Carapathians and the Solar Tempests, which brings me on to discussing the two factions. So in the story, the Carapathians aren't really Carapathians, they're more so just Colgarans using Carapathian equipment. Right up until the Red Guard show up, that is, those would be proper Carapathians, as since the Red Guard in the story are Leoyenith's personal honour guard, and they're here because Leoyenith's son Dengen is. Yep, if you remember Dengen from Fleet Commander, then he's back. I like Dengen, he's my boo. But also Leoyenith has a bit of a cameo at the end of the story too. I haven't yet designed what these characters look like, but it would be a missed opportunity to not give Dengen that cute nerd look and make him just absolute thirst bait. But the Principality of Carapath is really the only reoccurring faction here. There is the System Defense Forces, I guess, which technically go with the neutral/civilian ships from Locus Fleet Commander, but the neutral ships were in Fleet Commander weren't really their own faction, they were more so just an attachment to existing factions. The SDF, or the System Defense Forces, I guess you could still put in that same camp where they are meant to be attachments to other factions, because it does say that in the rules, but they are better designed to effectively be their own unique faction in Battle Command. Like, you can play the SDF just fine as you would be able to any other faction. Although if you were playing Fleet Commander and you decided to just use the neutral/SDF ships for that, then that would be a pretty Chad move. Carapath follows the same style of fighting as they do in Fleet Commander, where their units are lighter but more mobile. However, Carapath does enjoy a lot more long range weapons here than they do in Fleet Commander. A lot of their weapons are about the same sort of hitting as the Solar Tempests, but they do get pretty long range on their guns. While the System Defence Forces, as I've just mentioned, are mainly a peacekeeping force, they're more first-line defenders, and so much of their forces are not very hard-hitting. They're not very good weapons, they're not very good armour, and they're usually pretty slow vehicles. Basically everything they get is just bad. The thing about SDF forces though is that they get a lot of them. All the points costs are really cheap, meaning you can make a pretty decently big horde army from this. But yeah, in law, the SDF would mainly be fighting against like civilians. Well, I guess not so much civilians, but more so like cartels or criminal gangs. That would mainly be their forte. They leave fighting the horrific alien monsters up to the actual proper super soldiers. And so yes, things like the City Monitor, which fires white phosphorus canisters, is supposed to be deployed against civilian populations. Well, I guess the workers are advocating for rights again, better deploy the white phosphorus. Although mini uprisings and rebellions do happen quite often in law, and yes, they're usually pretty brutal. The next up are the Solar Tempests. Now the Solar Tempests are the Great Realm's main fighting force. They're effectively full-time soldiers, while the bulk of the Great Realm's military forces are made up really of system defense forces. Their proper army that they send into assault like enemies and go outside of their borders and destroy things are the Solar Tempests. Now the Solar Tempests, I do believe I have mentioned before, they're mentioned as a combined arms forces, which is true. They are given their own warships that they can operate independently of the Imperial Navy, but their warships are more oriented for planetary assaults and landing crafts. The Solar Tempests themselves do specialise in more so in ground combat. Solar Tempest forces are super soldiers given all sorts of genetic, biological and cybernetic enhancements depending on what their role is. The Solar Tempest forces are also exclusively male, as well as being racially homogeneous. There are a couple reasons for racial homogeneity within the Solar Tempest. The first is that they'll usually only recruit from a specific region, like the different legions will recruit from different regions where they'll usually operate in. And because the civilian population can be extremely restricted by the regime and where they can go, different regions themselves will often be very ethnically homogeneous. And the reason you don't get women in the Solar Tempest is because...
That reason is simple. When you put 120 pounds on the back of a woman, she crumbles like a fucking crouton.
However, I will say that this does kind of depend on species. There are many hundreds of thousands, millions even, species of humans within the Great Realm. All very strange and different, like some species of humans in Locus, for example, are hermaphrodites, and so you don't get male and female with them. However, for the standard races that you get throughout the majority of the galaxy, with Jantine being the most common race of humans, the male-female dynamics are standard as we would understand them. It's the same for the Carapathians. It's the same with the Carapathians because the Carapathian forces are also genetically engineered super soldiers designed to keep on par with the Tempest forces. So if any of you nerds decide to ask me,
"Oh my avocado toast, why does Locus have no women in its Solar Tempest legions?
Why are there no women in the Solar Tempests?" then I'm just going to point to my good friend Colonel Franco Sullivan to answer your question. Now, you do get women often in non-combat roles, primarily logistics, but there's not in the Solar Tempest. The Solar Tempest won't have women at all, but the Carapathians would often have women in the non-combat roles. Now, the System Defence Forces, on the other hand, the System Defence Forces do not care. If they're going to war, then you're getting a gun. They don't do civilian evacuations, those just don't happen. If they need to defend a planet, it doesn't matter whether you're a man, a woman, a child, or even if you're like pregnant or disabled, right? If you got a wheelchair, they're going to strap a rocket launcher to that wheelchair and just wheel you out to the battlefield. Remember, these are the guys who would consider Tiananmen Square a pastime. So if you think they care about things such as a soldier's well-being, then you are gravely mistaken. So Out of all of this though, you'll notice that there is one faction that I haven't yet mentioned, and that's the Herons. Now, Herons are mentioned briefly in Locus Fleet Commander as being related to the Zenthar, but still a distinct species. Herons are a genetic parasite, or Heron syndrome as it's called. It's an alien gene strand that infects a host and effectively acts as an STD, where you go on and then breed hybrids. These hybrids can be violent, suffer from delirium and psychosis, and their main goal is to effectively reproduce, create more hybrids, and destroy a planet's population from within. Many carriers of Heron syndrome will not often look all that distinct from a human, though after a couple of generations it is not unusual for various mutations to begin forming. Herons will also group together, so like with each other, they'll act as a closed-in group, and they will usually make groups that disguise themselves as often charitable, political, religious, or business organisations. They are considered to be kill on sight by most factions of the Great Realm, and so they will usually be hiding away. And they are the final faction that we see in Locus Battle Command. They aren't a fully formed faction because the idea about Herons is they don't really produce their own stuff. They just kind of steal whatever people have, which is why they really aren't getting a faction in Locus Fleet Commander. The best, I think, is just to use the civilian and neutral ships if you want to roleplay as Herons. But in the story, they're an insidious faction that have effectively cropped up on the world of Castile. It's unknown whether they came from outside of the planet just trying to pillage what they could while it was engulfed in flames, or if they previously existed there. That doesn't really matter. All that matters is you paste them across the floor. So with that being just the 4 factions that you can play as, I think it would be worth talking about what each faction gets. Because I've decided to give each faction a unique type of weapon. These Solar Tempests get sonic weapons. One of the more iconic vehicles that they have is the Sonic Tank, which is just a tank where instead of a gun it has this big just dish on the front of it that lets out a sonic blast. Which actually raises an interesting question, is what kind of beats do you think they're just blasting out of this thing? I'm going to take a bit of a tangent here because I did some research into what a sonic weapon would do to you. So the initial blast of a sonic weapon would probably be enough to shatter your bones. You'd have bone shards shredding up all of your organs. But that I don't think is the worst bit of it because it's such a short range weapon. What it's effectively doing is it's pushing away all of the air, kind of like an air tsunami, all of the air out in front of the vehicle away. But what this does is it creates a vacuum pocket in the air, which would suddenly cause all of the air to collapse back in on itself. Which means that if you're caught in the blast of a sonic weapon, your organs would be instantly shredded, but then they would be pulled out of your body towards the vehicle, like back towards the sonic tank. So you wouldn't actually be blasted away, you'd be sucked into it. You would also be turned into a fine paste on the ground. Like, you would literally just be goo. There wouldn't really be anything left. But luckily, it would happen so quickly that your brain couldn't even register it. Which means it'd be really freaky to watch because you couldn't even, register the moment the person was just standing there to the moment they just became a paste on the ground. It would just happen in a flash. Yeah, so the Solar Tempest specialise in sonic weaponry. Which, mind you, due to the sudden change in air pressure, if you were to hit a tank with that, you'd probably pop off all its hatches and mulch the crew inside. But the Carapathians get what's called Luminator weaponry. These are effectively long-range anti-tank lasers. Their primary purpose is just to hit heavily armoured targets. But if you're wondering what a Luminator cannon would do to you if it hit you, well, it would instantly evaporate all the water in your body, causing you to, explode. Carapath also get plasma weapons, actually. I didn't intend to just give them to Carapath, I was going to give them to other groups, but in the end I only ever gave them to Carapath. Plasma weapons may expand as more people may get them in the future. Although the Solar Tempest super heavy unit, the Sieger, does get a unique lightning cannon, which effectively just shoots electrical beams at anything in front of it. What else? Well, the SDF get white phosphorus. I did mention that before, they actually get it, and it's a pretty widespread, very good at taking out infantry kind of weapon. While the The Herons. The Herons get suicide. Yep, we now have Muslim representation in Locus. So that's the 4 factions that are currently in Locus Battle Commander covered. Not Battle Commander, Battle Command. Fuck, now I'm doing it. That thing that I said at the start that other people were going to do, I've fallen into the trap. Battle Command, right? Now that the 4 main factions for Locus Battle Command are done, or more so I've gone over them, I'm sure a question will pop into some people's heads. What about the 2 alien races from Locus Fleet Commander? Well, when going into making Locus Battle Command, I didn't really want to overcomplicate it. Originally, I was just going to have the Solar Tempests and the Principality of Carapath, but as things progressed, it ended up developing into 4 factions. But it is why the System Defense Forces and the Herons aren't all they aren't really full factions, like they're missing air units, for example. And they don't have a particularly wide variety of things. The main reason was I didn't want to take making this too long. I made this in 2 months, and I made Fleet Commander in 3 years. The reason probably Battle Command took me not that long to do was because the amount that I learned from making Fleet Commander. But effectively, I just didn't want to spend too long creating this before I actually had a finished product. Now that doesn't mean that the Zenthar and Kyril won't ever be in Battle Command. I have actually prototyped some models for them, which I will show on screen now. I've done more for the Zenthar than I have the Kyril, but you can get an idea for what both races are supposed to look like. And it is likely that I will make an expansion to Battle Command in the future that will introduce these 2 races. Now I also have some expansions for Fleet Commander planned that I have been prototyping as well. I'll likely just see whether Battle Command or Fleet Commander does best to see which expansion I should do first. But yes, they will come in the future, and I suppose this is the part of the video where I'm talking about my future plans. So with the Kyril, I've only prototyped infantry for them, but I want them to have mainly fast moving hover vehicles. I did have rules for hover vehicles, but since I never made any for, the base edition of Locus Battle Command, I removed those rules, and I'll save them for the expansion where you have the Kyril. The Zenthar, on the other hand, have war beasts where they have these huge genetically engineered monsters that they strap guns and other all sorts of weapons into them, heavily leaning into that same bestial look that they have in Locus Fleet Commander. But I do think much of what I've discovered here covers as well most of the basics for Locus Battle Command, and I do hope you enjoyed it. The game is free should you wish to download it. Oh, actually, screw it, before we move on, this is what I've just remembered. That's the scenery. I've been designing a lot of scenery for it, but I've made sort of building scenery where it's just panels, and you can stick the building scenery together. You put the walls together, the roof, and you can make the buildings as small or as big as you want. You can make this dinky little house, or you can make this just gigantic fortress. While I will have all the scenery included in Locus Battle Command for these buildings, there is a lot more that I want to do for them, like ruins and rubbles or other styles of buildings, and so I'm actually going to have the buildings in a separate file. They're going to be a separate downloadable thing, but they are made for Battle Command. What I've got now will be in the Locus Battle Command just pack that you can download, but the reason I'm also making a separate downloadable thing for them is because I said in the future there's more that I want to add to these buildings. And so it will be easier to do it that way than having to redo the entire Battle Command pack. But I suppose buildings like that, even though it's made for the 10mm scale of Battle Command, they can, I suppose, be used for any other wargame really. So feel free to use it at your leisure. But in future expansions of Locus Battle Command, there is a lot more that I do plan on doing with this building scenery. Even if you don't play Locus Battle Command, but you still do with the wargaming, stuff like this sort of terrain would be very good for your boards, I think. I will say that while we are on the subject of scenery, as part of the scenery there is actually a Shrike, which is one of the fighter units from Locus Fleet Commander. There is a landed Shrike as a scenery piece. However, the Shrike isn't actually the only vehicle that you may remember. In a lot of my earlier videos I do mention that I made a model of a TTC Harrier, but it's much bigger because I did originally plan to make this a 28mm scale game. But I sized it down a lot because, well, I thought it would make the battles a lot more epic and feel grander. And it does, I actually much prefer the smaller scale. But I already made it like 2 years ago, and so, well, it's still up there for you to download. So if you want the Solar Tempest support vehicle as more of, I say, display model, then it's there for you to download. And I think that for everything to do with Battle Command, that's about it. And so there is the question of what am I going to do in the immediate. Now, I think I'll let Locus marinate a little bit more before I start making more expansions to it, but there are other things that I want to work on. In what I believe is the first video of my channel, I mentioned a game called Lost Library, which is an RPG maker game that I'm developing. While that is nowhere near finished, I have made a demo for it, which I do plan on releasing soon. I just need to finish up all the bits for it, and I'll make a small video discussing a little bit of Lost Library. Now you might be wondering why I don't just focus on one thing at a time. Well, the answer to that is burnout. I'll usually have one main thing that I'm working on, but then work on something else on the side in case, I ever get burnt out with the main thing, so that I can go back to the main thing much easier. But this video is edging on 40 minutes now, and so I don't want to keep too much of your time. So I will actually cap this off with some explanations of how I plan to actually remarket Locus. Basically, Battle Command is going to be free. Some future expansions for it may cost money, but with Locus, I was selling each ship individually. I think, much like Battle Command, I'm just going to bundle Locus together and then just sell it all in one on websites such as Cults 3D, or if you want to come to my Discord and PayPal me the money, I can send you it over email. So if you'll remember, previously it was set up so that you had to buy each ship individually, but I'm figuring that kinda doesn't make all that much sense. At least not with the way I've oriented it, so now I'm selling it by expansions, I think would be better. So now you can just buy all 4 factions together for the base edition of Locus Fleet Commander. It will also be far cheaper than purchasing each ship individually. I'm very generous like that, but then I guess the question comes now, what happens to my Patreon? Well, I've got no idea. I think it will become more of a thing as I expand my roster of games. But there will be a little $1, $5 tier where you can show your appreciation for my works if you like them. I'll also sell a lot of stuff on Patreon too, because if you didn't know, you don't just subscribe on Patreon, you can just buy things as though it were a normal shop. If you enjoy Battle Command, then I'm pretty sure you're going to like Fleet Commander. And while Fleet Commander won't be free like Battle Command, the rules book is perfectly free to just download and give a look over. So you at least know what you're getting yourself into. Whatever, all the links will be in the description, but I'm effectively also going to repackage and sort of like reformat how I sell Locus Fleet Commander just to make it more easily accessible for people. My Patreon is still up and you can still get all of my things from there. But if you want to get into Locus Fleet Commander, because let's say you like Battle Command, well then it's going to be much easier to do so now. And if you like the sound of Locus as a setting, then on this very YouTube channel I have lore videos explaining its history and the different factions, with many more planned on the way. So my dear generals and admirals, depending on which Locus game you've decided to ascribe yourself to, you should like the video, subscribe to the channel, check out my games, and I will hope to catch you next time.